If you ever see a giant in the mountains of Badakhshan province in Afghanistan, just run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. My arrival in Badakhshan was not marked by ceremonies. The transport plane shook like a leaf in the wind as it descended toward the small makeshift airstrip, surrounded by massive mountains. It was a place that inspired a sense of insignificance, as if the mountains knew that all our military equipment and bravado were useless against their vastness and mystery. As soon as I got off, I found myself surrounded by the tired faces of soldiers who seemed to have long lost the spark of being there. The smell of diesel mixed with the dry, dusty air infested the place. At the forward base, every detail screamed precariousness. Worn-out tents, vehicles covered with signs of heavy use, and men who carried their weapons with the same indifference as someone carrying an old tool. I hadn't been there for more than 2 hours when I was called to a meeting. Sergeant Rook came to get me, a short, stocky man who seemed eternally bad-tempered. "Come on, Hayes. Meeting at the tactical center. Captain Radner wants everyone there." I hadn't even unpacked my bag yet, but I grabbed my cap and followed him. The sergeant walked quickly, dodging supply crates and other soldiers who seemed immersed in their repetitive routines. The meeting room was little more than a large tent, with a map of the region pinned to the wall and a metal table full of notes. Captain Jonas Radner was already there, accompanied by other officers. He was a tall man, with graying hair and a presence that filled the space. It didn't take much time with him to realize he was a reliable leader, the type who spoke little and always delivered on his promises. "Hayes, welcome to hell," he said with a smile. I tried to position myself near the table, but my eyes were immediately drawn to the map. Villages were marked with red circles, and many had an X crossed over them. "We have a problem, people," Radner began, tapping his finger on the map. "Over the last few weeks, mass disappearances have been reported in several locations across these mountains. We're not talking about insurgents sweeping through a village, taking men and burning the rest. It's as if people just evaporated." The tension in the room grew, but no one seemed surprised. This kind of mystery wasn't uncommon around there. "Our mission is simple. Find any clue about what's happening and ensure this isn't a new insurgent cell establishing itself. We've had sparse reports from survivors mentioning strange sounds and signs of destruction." "Destruction of what kind, sir?" I asked, more to break the silence. Radner hesitated. He seemed uncomfortable, which was rare. Houses crushed as if they were toys. Trees ripped from the ground. Tracks that make no sense. The room fell silent for a moment. That was when the local translator entered, bringing with him an elderly man. Thin, hunched over, his skin marked by time, and eyes of someone who had seen too much. He was introduced as Darvish, one of the elders of the region. "This is Darvish. He's agreed to speak with us to share what he knows about the disappearances." The elder approached, seeming to weigh each step, as if the ground around him were sacred. The translator began interpreting as Darvish spoke in a language I didn't recognize. His voice was low but carried a weight of gravity. "You are not looking for men," he began, pausing to fix us with deep eyes. "You are looking for what must not be disturbed." I exchanged glances with the other soldiers. Whatever he was saying wasn't something we wanted to hear. "What the hell does that mean?" one of the men beside me asked. The translator took a deep breath before continuing. "He says the mountains are alive, and that you will awaken something that should remain asleep." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Superstition, I thought. Darvish kept talking, his voice darker with every word. "When the giants walk, run, because you cannot kill them." Captain Radner crossed his arms, clearly impatient. "Thank you, Darvish. We'll take that into consideration." The elder's expression didn't change. He looked at each of us, as if recording us in his memory, and then left. The meeting ended shortly after, and the team began preparing for the mission. But those words, "the giants will walk," stuck with me. Not because I believed them, but because Darvish seemed so certain. That night, While I cleaned my rifle and checked my gear, I caught myself staring at the distant mountains. A cold wind blew between them, as if it carried the secrets of something no one else could hear. And that's when I realized, even without believing, I felt like something was watching us. The mountains of Badakhshan looked different in the morning, as if they had transformed overnight. Mist crawled along the slopes, making everything indistinct and strange. We began the journey before dawn, carrying heavy equipment and our own doubts. I walked in the middle of the formation with Sergeant Rook behind me, grumbling about the cold that cut like blades, and Captain Radner ahead, leading with the determination of someone who couldn't allow himself to hesitate. As we climbed, the vegetation thinned, and the uneven ground was replaced by packed snow. The silence was almost absolute, except for the sound of our boots crushing the snow and the occasional crackle of the radios. The steep slopes and gray sky seemed to swallow us. Even during the day, there was something oppressive about that place. After a few hours of hiking, one of the drone operators, Miller, stopped abruptly. He was staring at the monitor of his remote control, eyebrows furrowed. "Something wrong?" I asked, approaching him. "Footprints," he replied, pointing at the screen. I leaned in to look. The thermal camera showed marks on the ground covered by snow, but what caught my attention was their size. They looked like human footprints, but each one was twice the length of a normal boot. "Uneven terrain," I said, trying to dismiss the idea. "Probably ice erosion." Miller didn't look convinced but nodded. Captain Radner ordered the drone to be sent further ahead. The footprints continued in an irregular line, climbing up the slopes. "Probably a bear," someone in the group suggested. "A bear? My ass," Rook replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If that's a bear, it wears size 60 shoes." We continued in silence, following the path identified by the drone. As the afternoon wore on, the wind intensified, bringing an even greater sense of isolation. Around 5 p.m., we set up camp in a depression between the mountains. The sun was already beginning to disappear behind the peaks, and the temperature was plummeting quickly. While we prepared our positions, Sergeant Rook and another soldier, Ramirez, set up motion sensors around the area. Miller adjusted the night vision cameras, and Captain Radner studied the maps with a tense expression. I couldn't stop myself from looking at the slopes around us. The snow glistened under the last sliver of daylight, but there was something in the shadows. It was as if the horizon was always shifting, as though invisible eyes were following us. The first night in the mountains arrived. The cold was brutal, the kind of cold that made even breathing painful. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag inside the tent, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, almost like a voice whispering something incomprehensible. When my turn for guard duty came, I left the tent and immediately felt the impact of the freezing air on my face. I walked to one of the lookout points with my rifle in hand, trying to keep my mind occupied to push away fatigue. Everything seemed calm. The mountains were quiet, and the sky was so clear that I could see stars shining like tiny frozen beacons. That's when I noticed a strange sound. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, a distant echo, like a deep, pulsating lament. I turned my head toward the sound, but all I saw was darkness. I scanned the area with the night vision camera, but there was nothing there. Still, the sound continued, as if it were coming from deep within the mountain itself. Then, something glowed in the distance. It was a golden point, small but intense. The glow seemed to pulse, like a flame in the middle of the shadows. My eyes were fixed on it, trying to make sense of what it was. It flickered and moved slowly, disappearing at times only to reappear farther away. I thought about reporting it on the radio, but before I could press the button, the radio crackled violently, shattering the silence. "This is Hayes. Checking interference on the channel. Over." But there was no reply. Instead, I heard a faint sound in the static. It was a voice, said something but not in English. It wasn't a language I recognized, and it left me completely frozen. It was a low whisper, as though someone was speaking directly into my ear. Even though I was alone in the darkness, my heart raced. I pressed the radio button again. Repeat, who's on the channel? Silence. Then, the sound stopped, and the radio returned to normal. My fingers were so cold I could barely work the controls. I looked again toward the golden point, but it had vanished. I stood there, frozen, gripping the rifle tightly in my hands, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was just interference, or my mind playing tricks after hours of tension and cold. I decided not to report what had happened. When my shift ended, I returned to the tent and lay down, but sleep didn't come. All I could think about was the voice, the unknown language, and that golden light that seemed to call to me. The hike to the village was grueling. The wind grew crueler with every step, and the mountains around us seemed to close in, as if they were guiding us into a trap. The giant footprints we'd seen earlier continued to appear, some so deep it was impossible to ignore them. But no one spoke about them. We just marched on in silence, as if acknowledging what we were seeing was a surrender to the absurd. The village came into view around noon. It was a small collection of stone houses clustered along the slopes. From where we stood, it looked normal, except there was no sign of life. "Where are the people?" Miller asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe they're hiding, or they were evacuated." Radner replied, trying to keep his tone practical. But we all knew that wasn't the case. When we finally entered the village, an eerie silence enveloped us, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the absence of human sounds, but an absolute void, as if even the animals and the wind were afraid to make noise here. The houses stood with open doors, many ripped off their hinges. The ground was covered with massive footprints, but there was no sign of who or what could have made them. Simple tools, like shovels and baskets, were scattered across the streets, abandoned in haste. The first sign of violence appeared as we turned a corner. One of the houses had its wall marked by long gashes, as though something enormous had raked its claws across it. The marks were deep, cutting all the way into the stone. "This isn't the work of men," Rook muttered, almost to himself. Radner looked at him but said nothing. He was clearly uneasy, but determined to keep the team focused. We continued investigating, entering some houses. All of them were empty, with signs of struggle everywhere. Broken furniture, dark stains on the floor that looked like blood. Darvish, who accompanied us as an interpreter, was visibly shaken. He muttered quiet prayers, his eyes sweeping the environment as though he expected something terrible to appear at any moment. That's when we found the pile in the center of the village. It was goats, at least a dozen of them. They were stacked in a circle, like a macabre offering. Their bodies were coated in a bright orange substance, something that looked like powder or paint. None of them had visible injuries, but they were all dead, their eyes wide open in frozen terror. "What the hell is this?" Ramirez asked, his voice a mix of confusion and fear. Darvish took 2 steps back when he saw the pile. His eyes widened, and he began mumbling something in his native language. "What's he saying?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The translator seemed reluctant to respond, but finally said, "He says this is a warning, that they tried to appease the giants." "Giants?" Radner shook his head, visibly irritated. "Enough of this nonsense." Darvish grabbed Radner's arm, something that surprised all of us, given the respect he seemed to have for the captain until then. His eyes were filled with desperation. "We must leave," he pleaded. "This place is cursed." Radner pulled his arm free, stepping back. "We're here for answers, not to be intimidated by legends." The silence that followed was broken by a distant scream. It wasn't human. It was a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through the ground and made the air vibrate. We all froze. Even Radner seemed shaken. "Can anyone identify the direction?" he asked, but his voice had lost some of its firmness. The sensors didn't pick up anything, nor did the thermal cameras. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere, as though the mountain itself was screaming. Darvish fell to his knees, murmuring something while pressing his hands against his ears. "What's he saying now?" I asked the translator. The man hesitated before answering, his voice trembling. He says, "They are coming." Radner ordered us to regroup and set up a defensive position in the center of the village. I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to question his own decision to ignore the warnings. As we secured the perimeter, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was dense, heavy, charged with a suffocating anticipation. I looked up at the sky, hoping to find some comfort in the stars that were beginning to appear, but instead, I saw shadows not among the stars, but on the mountains. Something was moving up there, something big, and that's when I realized we were being watched. The silence of the village seemed to swallow us after we saw the shadows moving on the mountains. No one said anything, but it was clear that everyone felt the same thing. Fear. It wasn't a fear you could confront or ignore. It was as if the very air had changed, heavy with something ancient and unspeakable. Darvish was kneeling near the pile of goats, murmuring prayers. Captain Radner, his lips pressed tightly, signaled for the group to regroup. "We're moving. We're not staying here waiting for whatever this is. There's a cave nearby. We'll use it as a temporary base until we gather more information." "Temporary base?" Rook shot back, turning to the captain. "This is madness. The whole village has been wiped out and you want to head into a cave?" Radner didn't respond immediately. He looked at Rook, then at Darvish, still kneeling on the ground. "We can't return empty-handed, Sergeant. If we don't do anything, no one will believe us." He turned to the group. "We're on unknown ground, but we continue the mission." Rook cursed under his breath but didn't argue further. We followed Radner toward the coordinates of a cave that Miller had identified earlier using the drone. It was less than a kilometer south of the village, carved into the base of a mountain. The journey was silent. Each step seemed amplified by the compacted snow beneath our boots. From time to time, I looked back but saw nothing beyond our own footprints. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. By the time we reached the cave's entrance, the daylight was already starting to fade. The mouth of the cave was massive, an irregular opening surrounded by jagged rocks that looked like teeth. The air coming out of it was warmer than outside, but it carried an unpleasant smell, like something rotting. "Shelter viable?" Radner asked. Miller and Ramirez, both equipped with sensors and cameras, entered first. While we waited, Rook scanned the surroundings, and I approached Darvish, who looked increasingly uneasy. "What's in there?" I asked. He didn't look at me. He simply replied, "A tomb." The word sent chills through me, but before I could ask more, Miller returned. "Area's clear, Captain. There's enough space for everyone, and we didn't detect any movement." "All right, let's move in." Radner gestured toward the cave. "Maintain security. We're not letting our guard down." We set up our equipment near the entrance, creating a small improvised base. The cave stretched deeper inside, dark and cold, with damp walls covered in whitish moss. Miller and Ramirez began exploring farther in while the rest of us held our positions. I was adjusting my radio when I heard Miller over the channel. "Captain, I think you're going to want to see this." Radner immediately went to him and we followed. What we saw was strange. About 20 meters from the entrance, the cave walls changed. The rough rock gave way to something more polished, as though it had been carved and worked by hand. There were engravings on the walls, geometric patterns that made no sense to me. One of them, however, caught my attention immediately. It was a large symbol almost at the center of one of the walls. A broad spiral that narrowed into the shape of a hand with elongated fingers. "What is that?" Ramirez asked, his voice low, as though he feared waking something. "Who cares? Rook muttered, "This is old stuff. It has nothing to do with insurgents." I knew he was right, but there was something about the symbol that made me uneasy. I'd seen something similar in an old text about the Nephilim, but it seemed more primitive, more visceral. As I stared at it, a deep sound echoed from the darkness behind us. It wasn't a scream, nor a growl, but something that sounded like a mix of both. "Miller, fall back now." Radner's voice was firm but carried a note of urgency. Before Miller could respond, he screamed. The sound of his cries was abrupt and deafening. At first, I thought I was hearing it through the radio, but then I realized it was coming from the cave, resonating throughout the structure. We ran toward Miller's location, but when we rounded the bend in the tunnel, he was already gone. Only his flashlight remained, spinning on the ground, illuminating a pool of blood that looked fresh. "Miller!" Ramirez yelled, the panic clear in his voice. The screams continued for a few more seconds until they were cut off abruptly. Radner raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. We looked around, our flashlights sweeping the cave. That's when I saw another symbol, this time on the ground, carved into the middle of a new pool of blood. It was the same spiral as before, but smaller, more detailed, and it looked like it had been made hastily. "Captain, this isn't human work." My voice came out shaky, beyond my control. Rook began to back up, pointing his rifle into the darkness. "We can't stay here. Whatever took Miller is still here." Radner didn't say anything. He just stared at the blood on the ground, as if trying to process what had happened. Then he spoke, low but firm. "We need to know what happened." "What happened?" Rook stepped forward, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "Miller is dead, Captain. He's dead because we're involved in something we don't even understand." Before the argument could continue, Darvish stepped forward slowly, pointing to the symbol on the ground. He was visibly trembling. "They marked him. He wasn't enough. They want more." I wanted to ask who or what they were, but I already knew the answer. Even without fully understanding, something inside me already knew. The air felt still after Darvish's words. "They want more." Those 3 words echoed in my head as we returned to the cave's entrance. The ground crunched under our boots, and no one spoke. The silence wasn't just tense anymore. It was suffocating, almost alive. We set up our improvised camp just a few meters from the cave's entrance, where the icy mountain wind wasn't as cutting. Nobody wanted to go back inside. Not after what had happened to Miller. Radner ordered us to set up motion sensors and activate the night vision cameras around the perimeter. Snow began to fall, and the sound of flakes tapping against our helmets was almost comforting, like a distant reminder of something normal. But nothing here was normal. As I took my watch position, I couldn't help but look out into the darkness beyond the perimeter. The mountains, massive and unmoving, seemed different, as if they weren't just pieces of rock, but something more, something ancient. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every irregular shape reminded me of what I had seen before. The giant footsteps began around 2 in the morning. I was using the thermal equipment, scanning the distant slopes. The night was brutally cold, but the thermal view showed the surroundings in warm hues of red, orange, and yellow. It was strangely comforting, as though it gave me a sense of control. That's when I heard the first sound. A deep, dull thud that made the ground vibrate slightly. I lifted the thermal scope and looked around. Nothing. The sound came again, louder this time, as though something incredibly heavy was moving, but deliberately. "Captain, something's approaching." My voice came out shaky, despite my efforts to sound calm. Radner appeared by my side, adjusting his helmet as he looked through the scope I handed him. "Where?" I pointed to a distant slope, maybe 300 meters away. He took the scope and looked for a few seconds before freezing. "It's too big to be human." "It can't be human," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The thing was still now, but it was colossal. Through the thermal scope, It appeared as a humanoid figure, hunched over, with arms that looked far too long for its body. Its outlines were distorted, as though the heat around it didn't obey natural laws. "Don't shoot." Radner lowered the scope. His voice was firm, but there was a crack in it. A tone of uncertainty I'd never heard before. "Until we're sure what it is, nobody fires." I passed the scope to Rook, who also froze when he saw the figure. He muttered something unintelligible before shutting the device off. Meanwhile, Darvish was on the other side of the camp, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer. Ramirez approached him but soon returned, his face pale. "He's saying we're doomed, that this is punishment." The smell came right after. It was a sulfurous odor, strong enough to make my eyes burn. It seemed to seep into everything, the snow, the equipment, even the air we breathed. "That smell isn't normal." Ramirez covered his face with the collar of his uniform. Radner raised his hand, silencing everyone. Then we heard another sound. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was a low, deep sound, like a moan reverberating from all directions. It made the ground vibrate and the mountains hum. I looked up and realized the thing had vanished from the thermal scope. "It's closer," I murmured. Darvish began chanting loudly now, as if trying to protect us with his words. But his voice was filled with desperation, and that only heightened our sense of helplessness. "Someone shut that old man up," Rook yelled, his voice tinged with fear and anger. But nobody moved. Everyone was trapped in the same fear as him. I adjusted the thermal scope again and swept the landscape. That's when I saw it. The colossal figure was now less than 200 meters away. It didn't move like something alive should. Its movements were slow, as though gravity itself were fighting against it. But it was impossible to look away. Its humanoid shape was wrong, distorted. Even from this distance, I could see it wasn't a creature made of flesh like us. It was more rock and heat, something primordial that shouldn't be here. "Captain, it's looking at us." Radner froze for a moment. Then he turned to the group. "Nobody fires." I repeat, nobody fires. The low sound grew louder, now accompanied by something else. A pressure in the air, like the very world was being compressed around us. Darvish started shouting his prayers, tears streaming down his face. "You woke them. You brought this here. They will devour us." "Enough!" Radner shouted, but his voice no longer had authority. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run. But where? We were surrounded by mountains, and that thing, it wasn't something you could run from. All I could think about was Miller, and how, eventually, all of us would disappear like he had. The thing took another step toward us, and the sound of its footsteps echoed like thunder across the mountains. The night felt endless. The giant didn't advance further, but it didn't disappear either. It stayed there, motionless, watching us from the shadows while the sulfuric stench saturated the air. No one slept, not even Captain Radner, who kept his weapon in his hands the entire time, trying to hide the fear we all shared. When the first pale light of dawn illuminated the mountains, the thing was gone. Only enormous tracks in the snow marked its retreat into the higher peaks. "We're getting out of here," Radner said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We'll head through the pass. It's the only possible route." No one questioned him. We gathered our equipment, adjusted the remaining sensors, and began a slow march. The elder, Darvish, refused to leave the cave, murmuring something about it being the only safe place. Radner didn't insist. I didn't know if that was pragmatism or pure relief at not having to deal with him anymore. The pass was about a kilometer east, between two peaks that looked like jagged teeth. The passage was narrow and uneven, covered in heavy layers of snow that made every step a struggle. The drones had shown the path led to an open plateau, where we hoped to find answers or maybe an escape. As we walked, the silence of the mountains was broken only by the sound of our boots and the distant echo of the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. "Lucas, you see anything?" Rook asked, his voice low. I raised the thermal scope, scanning the slopes around us. Nothing. But you feel it, don't you? He insisted. I nodded, saying nothing more. We reached the pass around 9 in the morning. The steep walls around us blocked most of the light, plunging the passage into a cold, dim twilight. The giant's footprints were still visible, deep and spaced apart, as if it had crossed the area recently. Radner ordered us to advance in formation, with sensors at the front and rear. I was in the middle of the group, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. That's when the attack began. The first sound was a loud crack, like splintering wood. Ramirez, who was at the rear, shouted something, but before we could react, an entire tree came flying out of the shadows and struck 2 men in the group. They didn't stand a chance. The impact was so powerful their bodies vanished beneath the snow, crushed by the force of the blow. Contact, Rook shouted, raising his rifle and firing toward the source of the attack. We all took position, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the pass. That's when I saw it. The giant emerged from the shadows like a nightmare. It was more than 6 meters tall, its body covered in something that looked like a mixture of rock and skin. Its arms were long and muscular, ending in grotesque hands with wide fingers that looked capable of crushing steel. But what disturbed me the most was its face. It was human, or almost. The features were grotesquely familiar. A mouth far too large, a flattened nose, and eyes that glowed like golden embers. It was like staring at a caricature of something that should have been human, but had been twisted by forces beyond comprehension. Radner gave the order to open fire, and the pass filled with the deafening sound of gunfire. Tracer rounds tore through the air, striking the giant from every direction. Nothing happened. The bullets ricocheted off its body as if it were made of stone, leaving nothing but sparks where they struck. Took a step forward, and the ground trembled like an earthquake. Fall back, Radner shouted, but it was already too late. With a swift motion, the giant lifted a tree trunk, using it as an improvised weapon, and hurled it toward one of the vehicles. The sound of twisting metal was deafening, and the vehicle was flung to the side, exploding into a cloud of flames and smoke. I threw myself to the ground, covering my head as screams filled the air. Ramirez tried to run, but the giant grabbed him in one hand, lifting him like he was nothing more than a toy. Ramirez's scream was short. The sound of his bones breaking was much longer. Fall back, fall back. Radner kept shouting, but the formation had completely dissolved. I ran alongside Rook and 2 other men, trying to escape the ravine. The giant didn't immediately follow us. Instead, it stood still for a moment, watching, as if it were studying us. Its golden eyes seemed to burn even brighter in the morning light. Finally, it let out an ear-splitting roar, something so loud that the walls of the ravine vibrated, and the snow began to fall in small but threatening avalanches. We managed to escape the ravine and regroup on a small slope, where Radner took a head count. Ramirez? Benson? He called, but no one answered. 12 had entered the ravine. Only 6 came out. Radner didn't say a word. He just looked at the trail of destruction the giant had left behind, his face a mask of helplessness. "This isn't a recon mission anymore," he finally said. "We're in territory of something that shouldn't exist." No one disagreed, and no one knew how we would make it out alive. The thick snow crunched beneath our boots as we moved away from the ravine. The air was freezing, but I could barely feel the cold. My whole body felt numb, operating on autopilot. We were only 6 now, half of the original group. The image of the giant using Ramirez like a broken toy was still burned into my mind. Captain Radner led us ahead, silent, his movements deliberate. He wouldn't admit it, but he was as scared as the rest of us. Rook followed close behind, his face tense, eyes darting to every shadow that moved. The sky was beginning to darken again, and we knew we couldn't remain exposed much longer. "We need shelter," Rook whispered, almost to himself. By now, they know where we are. Radner nodded without looking at him. There's another cave nearby. Darvish mentioned it yesterday. It's at the base of the next slope. I looked at Darvish, who walked at the back of the group, nearly dragged by the icy wind. He hadn't said a word since the attack, his eyes fixed on the ground, as though the weight of some secret had doubled him over. Took us nearly 2 hours to reach the new cave. The entrance was smaller than the first, almost hidden among weathered rocks and piles of snow. Radner was the first to enter, shining his flashlight inside. No signs of movement, he said, his voice low. Let's get inside. I was the second to pass through the entrance. The air inside felt different, drier and somehow heavier, as though the space was charged with something ancient and forgotten. My boots stepped on something that wasn't stone or snow. When I looked down, a chill ran through me. They were bones. Holy God! Rook whispered, shining his flashlight on the ground. The cave was full of them. Piles of human bones were scattered in the corners, some still partially covered in decayed rags. Among the remains were rusted weapons, swords, spears, and even ancient muskets. It was as though men from various eras had perished here, all drawn to the same fate. This looks like a damn ossuary, Ramirez muttered, his voice faint. Rook kicked a nearby pile, revealing something gleaming beneath the bones. I knelt down and picked up the object. It was a metal coin, large and heavy, but strange. As I moved it under the flashlight, the symbols etched into it seemed to shift, almost alive. A warped spiral appeared from one angle, while from another, it looked like eyes or open hands. What the hell is this? I murmured, passing the coin to Radner. I don't know, but someone went through a lot of trouble to make it, he replied, examining it closely. Looks like some kind of offering or ritual coin. While the others continued exploring, Darvish stopped at the back wall. He didn't say a word, but his flashlight trembled in his hand. I approached and saw him staring at an inscription carved into the rock. What does it say? I asked, but Darvish didn't respond. Then I saw the characters. It was ancient Hebrew or something very similar. I recognized a few words, thanks to a theology course I had taken years ago. I ran my hand over the cold surface and read aloud, not realizing what I was doing. The Sentinel of Shamaran, guardian of the mountain, awakened by the arrogance of men. What does that mean? Rook asked, eyeing me with suspicion. I didn't respond immediately. My brain was working to connect the dots. Shamaran. The name sounded familiar, something tied to ancient Middle Eastern mythology, connected to mystical beings and guardians. Darvish finally spoke, his voice weak and resigned. They are the Sentinels, the guardians of this land. They were placed here long before us, before the first men. Sentinels? Radner stepped closer, his expression hard. Guardians of what? Darvish turned to him, his eyes wet with fear. Guardians of what should not be touched. The secrets the mountain hides. My people have always known. We made the offerings, the painted goats, to appease them, to keep them sleeping. The silence that followed Darvish's words felt like a weight pressing down on us. I looked again at the bones and weapons around us. Men had been here before, armed men determined just like us, and none of them had come out alive. Captain, we have to get out of here, I said, my voice low but firm. This thing, these sentinels, they can't be killed. Not until we get answers, Radner replied, though his voice no longer carried the same conviction. Answers? Rook shot back, exasperated. Answers for who, Captain? We've all seen what happened. Ramirez and the others were torn to pieces. Before Radner could respond, a sound echoed from the cave's entrance. It was a dull, heavy thud, like something massive hitting the ground, followed by another, and another, the giant. Rook aimed his flashlight toward the entrance, but all we could see was the vapor of its breath clouding the freezing air. The faint light barely illuminated its colossal silhouette, but it was enough to paralyze us. Its golden eyes glowed in the dark, fixed on us, as though it could see through the very walls. "Turn off the lights," I whispered, my voice nearly inaudible. Radner motioned for everyone to obey, and one by one, the beams from our flashlights died. We stood there, in absolute darkness, listening to the sentinel's breathing and its movements. It was close, far too close. No one dared breathe. The silence became unbearable, a void filled only by the low, rhythmic sounds of that being. I could feel the ground vibrate with each of its steps. Darvish began murmuring again, a low, desperate chant, as if it could protect us. But I knew it couldn't. The sentinel was there, and it was waiting. The sound of its steps finally receded, though the silence that followed was just as terrifying as the monster's presence. We remained motionless for endless minutes, waiting for it to change its mind and find us in that oppressive darkness. The air in the cave grew even heavier, and the smell of sulfur lingered, a reminder of what hunted us. When we finally felt safe enough to turn the flashlights back on, Captain Radner was the first to speak. His voice was harder now, almost brutal. "No one else dies here. We're getting off this mountain." He turned to Darvish, who was sitting on the ground, his hands clenched around his knees, murmuring to himself, "And you, old man, are going to guide us." Darvish didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on nothing, as though his mind were far away. I said, "You're going to guide us?" Radner roared, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him up roughly. The motion made the elder groan in pain. For the first time, he seemed to understand what was happening around him. "You knew what we were up against, didn't you?" Radner continued, his voice growing with anger. "From the start." Darvish didn't try to free himself. He looked at the captain with eyes full of something that seemed like sadness or guilt. "I knew," he finally murmured, his voice faint and weak. Rook, Ramirez, and I exchanged incredulous glances. "What?" Rook was the first to react. "You knew?" Darvish took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. "They came to me, the men, the insurgents. They threatened my village, my family. They said if I didn't help them find the cave, if I didn't guide them here, they would kill everyone." "What men? What are you talking about?" Radner demanded. "Insurgents. They'd heard the stories, the legends of the mountains. They wanted weapons, power, anything they could use against you, against the world. They didn't understand. None of them understood." Darvish stopped, visibly trembling. "Understood what?" I asked, my voice low but firm. He looked at me, his eyes full of a truth I wasn't ready to hear. That it's not about weapons or power. The sentinel, it guards something far older. It sleeps as long as it is respected, as long as traditions are followed. "And what happened?" Rook pressed, furious. Darvish lowered his head, as if carrying an invisible weight. "The insurgents, they violated the sanctuary. They took the coins, the symbols, burned the offerings. I warned them, I begged them, but they didn't listen." His voice began to shake. "They woke it up." We all fell silent, digesting his words. It was hard to accept, but after everything we'd seen, how could we deny it? "So you knew the whole time we were walking straight into the mouth of hell?" Rook exploded, moving toward Darvish. Radner held out an arm, stopping him. "And why didn't you tell us?" the captain asked, his voice now controlled but still heavy with fury. "I hoped you could escape before it found you," Darvish whispered, looking at us. "But now it's too late. This is bullshit," Rook shouted, spinning toward Radner. "Captain, we can't trust this old man anymore. He led us here. He's the reason for all of this." "Enough!" Radner's voice thundered through the cave. "It doesn't matter how we got here. What matters is getting out alive." He turned back to Darvish. "If you want any chance at redemption, you're going to guide us out of this damn mountain." Darvish took a deep breath, as though he were battling with himself. "There is no way out," he said, his gaze heavy. "Not while the sentinel is awake. It's not something that can be defeated, only appeased." "Appeased? How?" I asked, unable to hide the incredulity in my voice. Darvish closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember something ancient. "The offerings were the only way. Blood, life to calm it. Not out of hatred, but out of respect." He paused, his eyes locking onto mine. "But you came with weapons. You entered its domain with arrogance. That cannot be forgiven so easily." "What the hell does that mean?" Rook asked, now more alarmed than angry. Darvish sighed deeply, like someone carrying the weight of a curse. "It means there's no offering big enough to satisfy it now. Not while you're alive." Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. No one said anything. The only sound was the wind outside, whistling mournfully through cracks in the cave. Radner finally broke the silence, his jaw clenched tight. "This is superstition. Legends. We're getting out of here and you're going to guide us. Understood?" Darvish didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, resigned. I walked to the back of the cave, where the coins were still scattered among the bones. I picked one up and held it to the light of my flashlight. The symbols continued to shift, as though the coin itself were alive. A spiral ending in an open hand. The sentinel. Suddenly, a terrible sensation swept over me. Something was close. I looked at the others, but no one seemed to notice. That's when the sound began again. A distant thud, heavy, rhythmic. "No," Darvish murmured, covering his face with his hands. "It's coming." Radner raised his weapon, his eyes cold and determined. "Get ready." And then the ground began to shake. The cave floor trembled as if something immense were moving in the depths. Each distant impact made the walls vibrate, dislodging small stones that rolled to our feet. The sound was unmistakable. The sentinel was coming. "We need to get out of here," Rook shouted, his eyes wide. "And go where?" Radner shot back, his voice firm but devoid of answers. Darvish remained still, murmuring his prayers, his gaze lost in the darkness of the tunnel ahead. The sound of footsteps was growing closer. Each impact reverberated in my chest, as if the very mountain were breathing. "There's no escape," Darvish finally said, his voice weak but filled with cold certainty. "Not this time." "Then what do we do, huh? Just sit here and wait to die?" Rook shouted, spinning toward the old man. Darvish slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes brimming with tears and desperation. "The altar," he whispered. Radner narrowed his eyes. "What altar? What are you talking about?" Darvish took a deep breath, as though every word cost him more strength than he had left. "There is a sacred place, an ancient altar, where offerings were made to the sentinel. The only way to calm it is to give something significant, something that proves humility." "Humility?" Rook laughed humorlessly, his teeth clenched. "What the hell does that mean?" I don't know what made me speak, but at that moment the words came on their own. "The coins." Everyone looked at me. I pulled out one of the coins I'd kept, the one with the shifting symbols that seemed to move under the light. I could feel its weight in my hands, something more than just cold metal. "What are you saying, Hayes?" Radner asked, tense. "These coins," Darvish said, "the insurgents stole them, that it disturbed the sentinel. Maybe they're part of the offering. Maybe this is what it wants back." Radner stared at me for a second, then turned to Darvish. "Is it true?" Darvish nodded slowly. "The sentinel does not seek destruction. It seeks respect. Those who do not respect it perish." "Then we go to this altar," Radner ordered. "And if it doesn't work?" Rook asked, his voice a mixture of fear and frustration. "The alternative is waiting to be smashed like Ramirez. Would you prefer that?" Radner shot back, adjusting his rifle, even though he already knew it was useless against the sentinel. There was no time left to argue. We followed Darvish as he led us deeper into the cave. Each step was accompanied by the booming sounds, thuds that echoed behind us. The sentinel was following us, its slow and deliberate footsteps making it clear that it knew exactly where we were going. The tunnel opened into a vast, circular chamber, larger than anything I could have imagined existing beneath that mountain. In the center stood an altar, an ancient stone structure covered in intricate symbols, spirals, and humanoid shapes. It seemed to pulse under the beam of our flashlights, as though it were waiting. There, Darvish pointed urgently, almost desperately. Radner and Rook kept their eyes on the entrance while I approached the altar. My hands trembled as I pulled the coins I had kept from my pocket. They felt heavier now, as if they understood what was about to happen. "Come on, Hayes," Rook shouted, looking toward the darkness where the deafening footsteps were now echoing louder. I knelt before the altar, feeling the ground vibrate beneath my knees. The air reeked of sulfur and dust, each breath burning my throat. A voice in my head told me it was madness, but somehow it felt like the right thing to do. I placed the coins at the center of the altar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shook. "My God!" Rook muttered, stepping back. The sentinel appeared at the chamber entrance. His presence filled the space like a force of nature. It ducked to enter, its colossal body folding in on itself, golden eyes burning like embers in the darkness. Its distorted form seemed alive, its stone-like surface shifting as if magma pulsed beneath it. It stopped there, staring directly at the altar. The coins glowed now, illuminated by a light that didn't come from us. Then it turned its eyes to me. I felt my body freeze. This gaze was impossible to describe. It wasn't anger or hatred, but something deeper, something that seemed to pierce through me, judging every part of who I was. Couldn't breathe. Darvish fell to his knees beside me, murmuring something in his language. The sentinel moved slowly toward the altar, each step shaking the ground. It extended one of its enormous hands, grotesquely long fingers reaching down, and picked up the coins. For a moment, time seemed to stop. It held the coins, observing them for what felt like an eternity, before turning its eyes back to me. Then, without warning, it began to retreat. "It's working," Darvish whispered, tears streaming down his face. The sentinel took several steps back until its massive form disappeared into the darkness of the chamber entrance. The sound of its footsteps grew fainter and fainter until it was gone completely. The silence that followed was as deafening as the chaos that had preceded it. "Is it gone?" Rook asked, disbelief clear in his voice. I stood up, still trembling, staring at the now empty altar. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, as though the mountain had finally exhaled a long-held breath. Radner turned to Darvish. "What happened?" Darvish slowly rose, wiping tears from his face. It accepted the offering, for now, but something inside me told me this wasn't over. Still breathless, we stepped away from the altar. No one dared to speak, as though any sound might call the sentinel back. The air still reeked of sulfur, but the chamber felt peaceful. For the first time since we had entered that mountain, there was silence. Radner broke the quiet. "What was that, Darvish? What did it say?" Darvish, still shaken, looked at the ground before answering. It spoke to him. He pointed to me, to Lucas. "To me?" My voice came out hoarse, incredulous. Darvish nodded. It said, "You recognized my presence. I will spare the humble." "The humble?" I murmured, the words turning over in my mind. Rook let out a tired breath. "So that's it? We survived?" Darvish nodded again, but his expression was still somber. "She spared us, yes, but remember, this mountain does not belong to us. It never did." Captain Radner took a deep breath, looking toward the tunnel that would lead us back to the surface. "Let's get out of here, now." As we walked, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The altar chamber was dark now, but I could still feel the sentinel's presence. It didn't attack us because we showed respect, because we returned what had been stolen. But a terrible certainty haunted me. If anyone ever dared to disturb the mountain again, the sentinel would return, and there would be no mercy.